The administrator of the Northern Territory was in no danger. He didn't see anyone on his way to the jetty. No one knew he was there. Even if they did, the light of the waning gibbous moon wouldn't have been bright enough for them to recognise him. And yet there must have been a spring in the step of John Gilruth as he trod along the boardwalk towards the ship that would deliver him from the town he no longer knew. Years earlier, he had reported to his superiors that the territory was a white man's country, an Eden, and everything else that could be desired. The man who stepped aboard the HMAS Encounter that night had no such idyllic view of the top end. A few years later, he would refer to the territory in a newspaper column as hopeless, worthless, and useless. What had happened to Gilruth that had disenchanted him so? What would his departure mean for the territory's future? To answer those questions, we must first understand what had brought Gilruth to Darwin. For centuries, the top end had been a hub of activity, even before colonisation. Trade with the Makassar people from what is now Indonesia saw relations established between local Aboriginal peoples and much of Southeast Asia. The Dutch passed by the area, unhelpfully naming it Van Diemen's Land, a name that would later be used for Tasmania. Eventually, British colonists founded the township of Palmerston on the northwest of what was then part of South Australia, having previously been part of New South Wales. The small township was administered by South Australia through Federation until 1911, when the land was ceded to the federal government. While this meant that the Northern Territory was able to be properly defended from invasion by the better-resourced Commonwealth government, the change had a dire effect on the democratic rights of Territorians. With the stroke of a pen, Territorians had not only lost their ability to contribute to their own governance through the Parliament of South Australia, but also through the Commonwealth Parliament, as electors who had previously voted in the division of Grey now had no MP and no senators. The following year, a ship sailed into Port Darwin, bringing with it the newly appointed administrator of the Northern Territory, an unelected authority who answered only to the federal government. The first appearance of John Gilruth's name in the NT Times and Gazette in May 1912 appeared alongside a report about a deputation sent to speak with the minister responsible for the Northern Territory, Josiah Thomas. When Thomas was asked to carefully consider the question of granting some measure of local and popular control, his reply was unsympathetic. It was an inauspicious beginning to federal control of the territory. Gilruth was born in Scotland in 1871 and was trained as a vet. He had worked for the New Zealand Department of Health as chief veterinarian and government bacteriologist before moving to Australia, where he was tasked with surveying the NT for economic opportunities. Following this, he took the position of administrator of the NT. By his side was Henry Carey, a public servant whose workload rapidly increased, from government secretary to chief protector of Aborigines, public trustee and sheriff, chief censor, Director of Agriculture and Director of Lands, taking on the latter two roles following Gilruth's dismissal of his predecessors. Labor Senator Miles Ferrix later remarked that Carey was appointed practically to everything that was going, and was there to do Dr. Gilruth's dirty work. While the federal government deserves its share of the blame for Gilruth's bad reputation, he held his own when it came to putting people offside. In 1915, the government nationalised pubs and hotels in the territory, officially to address bootlegging, but in reality to raise revenue. The Labor government's policy was only to hire union workers for government jobs, and as the Australian Workers' Union excluded Asian and Aboriginal workers, the new supervisor of hotels could only hire white workers. He drew up a scheme for wages, only to have Gilruth intervene to cut waitresses' pay by a third, which kicked off an extended period of strikes and boycotts of state hotels. After the First World War ended, some waitresses at the hotels wanted leave to celebrate. Their customers were happy to drink elsewhere, but Gilruth arbitrarily refused to grant them leave and then locked them out of the hotels after they failed to show up for work. Later in 1915, the government abolished the Palmerston District Council, further weakening the voice of the residents of Darwin in their government's decision-making. It was replaced by an advisory council which had 2 elected members, 2 appointed members, and an appointed chair. Gilruth's right-hand man, Carey, added the chair of the advisory council to his lengthy list of responsibilities. Tensions boiled over when the price of a bottle of beer was increased by 3 pence in late 1918. December saw protracted industrial action and another boycott of the state hotels, led by AWU leader Harold Nelson. The NT News, who had long reviled Gilruth's administration, reported favourably upon the rallies held by the AWU throughout December. The tensions came to a head on the 17th of December, when a crowd of up to 1,000 demonstrators marched on Government House and demanded to be addressed by Gilruth. The administrator declared that he was answerable to the minister and would not and did not recognise the citizens of Darwin. A deputation sent in by the protesters coaxed Gilruth out eventually, where he reiterated his intention to remain in his position as administrator while he enjoyed the confidence of the minister. As he turned to walk back inside, the picket fence of Government House collapsed. The crowd roughed up Gilruth as he fled to the shelter of Government House, which sustained some superficial damage. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that the crowd was told to disperse by Nelson, an order which they obeyed after burning an effigy of Gilruth outside of Government House. Though he remained the administrator, Gilruth was on the way out as 1918 became 1919. A gunboat, the Una, was stationed at Port Darwin for his protection. Gilruth was soon recalled by the government, travelling to Melbourne on the HMAS Encounter on the 20th of February. Gilruth administered the territory from Melbourne for a few months, until the position was abolished in June. The remnants of the Gilruth regime, including Carey, Judge David Bevan, and Government Secretary Roland Evans, were compelled by Nelson and his crowd to leave the territory by the next available boat in October 1919. On one reading, the story of Gilruth's deposition is a tale of a popular uprising against a despotic administrator. On the other hand, it could be viewed as a flawed leader being undermined by a militant unionist with political ambitions. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. While Gilruth conducted himself poorly on multiple occasions, Nelson was not entirely pure of heart either, as evidenced by his push for the removal of Carey, Bevan and Evans, which historian Cathy Delarue said came at a time when doubts were being openly expressed about Nelson's agenda and his strategy. Following what became known as the Darwin Rebellion, the struggle for representation continued. A new, more collaborative administrator named Miles Smith brought word that the Hughes government would legislate to give the residents in the territory a representative in the Senate of the Commonwealth Parliament who will be entitled to speak and vote on all territorial questions. Despite Hughes nationalists being in control of the Senate, the bill was rejected. A very limited form of territory representation was finally achieved in 1922 with the creation of the Division of Northern Territory, whose representative would not be able to vote on any matter and would not count towards the formation of government. The Labour-aligned Northern Standard called the representation humiliating and the lack of consultation in Canberra's making of ordinances for the territory a direct invitation to the territory to rebel, not necessarily by force of arms, but, at all events, by simmering antagonism to the government. Territorians chose Harold Nelson as their first representative. It was his strong pressure, territory historian Dean Jernsch proposes, that pushed the Scullin Labor government to legislate for an ordinance-making legislative council. Once again, Senate Conservatives disposed of the bill. Though Nelson never voted in a division, it would not be ever thus for representatives of the territory, following a 1936 amendment which allowed them to vote on ordinances of the Northern Territory. Finally, following the election of a Labor majority in both Houses of Parliament, legislation was passed to create the Northern Territory Legislative Council in 1947. The establishment of the Northern Territory Legislative Council was a breakthrough for territory rights. Being legislated meant that a later government would have more trouble abolishing it than the previous advisory councils, though it was by no means entrenched. It was also the first body with the power to make ordinances for the territory, in a limited form of self-government. This was a big change, as the Australian Capital Territory, which was also created in 1911, would not gain such a power until 1989. The council began with 14 members, 6 elected, 7 appointed, and the administrator, who held a casting and deliberative vote. Adair Blaine, the member for the Northern Territory after Nelson, noted at the time that the council was composed of a majority of public servants, who will have to be yes-men, otherwise they will lose their jobs. Votes did not always fall along elected nominated lines, however, and the administrator and the federal government still retained the right of veto over any decisions the council made. The right to vote in the Legislative Council was granted to all Territorians over the age of 21 who had lived in Australia for at least 6 months, except for those of unsound mind, criminals serving a sentence of 12 months or greater, and Aboriginal Australians. Māori adults were permitted to vote, however. The franchise was extended to Aboriginal Australians in 1962. Voting was compulsory, but poor lines of communication in the Territory led to an incomplete electoral roll, which remained a problem throughout the Council's history. Candidates running for the Legislative Council needed to meet all the aforementioned criteria, as well as being residents of the Territory for at least 3 months prior to the close of nominations. Those who wished to nominate would have to put up a deposit of £10, which is just over $800 in today's money. If the candidate received at least 10% of the primary vote, they would get their deposit back. Today, it costs $2,000 to nominate for the Federal Parliament, however the salaries for the Legislative Council were meagre. MLCs elected in 1947 earned just £75 a year, or $6,241 in today's money. It wouldn't be until the 1960s that this amount was substantially increased ahead of inflation. 5 electorates were created, with Darwin returning 2 members and the others returning 1. The system for the election of the single-member electorates was compulsory preferential voting, but the system for the election of Darwin members used the block voting system of the pre-1949 Federal Senate. The first candidate was elected using regular preferential voting, but the second was elected by first distributing the preferences of the first elected candidate, and then the remaining preferences were again distributed. The Legislative Council switched to single-member electorates before the reforms of 1949, which brought in proportional representation. Today, the Northern Territory is largely controlled by 2 main parties, the Labor Party and the Country Liberal Party. Initially, most members of the Legislative Council had no party affiliation. The North Australia Workers' Union, which was affiliated with the ACTU, endorsed some candidates, but there was little discipline in the Labor movement. Labor candidates ran against NAWU candidates, who ran against independent NAWU candidates. Similarly, beginning in the 1950s, country organisations, as well as the actual Country Party, began contesting seats, often against each other. The Liberal Party tried to get a foothold at the 1968 election, but failed to win a seat against the established Country Party. By 1974, the 2 parties merged to form the Country Liberal Party. Despite the Federal Country Party renaming itself to the Nationals a few years later, the country name remains in use in the Territory today. The elected members of the Legislative Council continued to push towards self-government. The inaugural election saw Labor run on a platform of abolishing the veto of the administrator. Calls for a majority of elected members over appointees on the council were made ad nauseum. Resignations were frequently used to signal the frustration of elected members at federal intervention in territory affairs. Harold Tiger Brennan resigned in 1956 following nominated members blocking, for the 4th time, an ordinance legalising off-course betting. Brennan was re-elected unopposed at the ensuing by-election. The 1957 election, after 10 years of government control, was seen as a virtually unanimous demand for elected members to constitute a majority on the council. Following radio silence from Canberra, all 6 elected members of the council resigned in protest. Following their largely uncontested re-election, Minister for Territories Paul Hasluck legislated to provide for 8 elected members, 6 appointees from the public service and 3 citizen appointees, who would hold the balance of power and had no vested interest in voting with the government as the officials did. The elected members and the Territory at large were unsatisfied with this would-be concession, and again called for a majority-elected council. The 1962 election saw Aboriginal Australians enrol to vote for the first time. This proved a divisive issue during the campaign, with council member Nathaniel Hargrave suggesting undue influence was used to affect the enrolment of Aboriginal Australians. Director of Welfare Harry Glees retorted in the NT News that you can't win in this business. If few natives had enrolled, there would have been a clamour about their slow rate of progress. If many enrolled, there are claims that undue pressure has been used. Aboriginal communities in Arnhem Land recorded a remarkably low informal vote. Despite their inexperience with voting in elections, just 0.9% of the 412 votes cast were informal, while at the 1961 federal election, the informal rate was 2.5%. In 1968, the decision was made to finally give the Legislative Council an elected majority. While this gave hope that the decisions of the Council would now be more in line with the views of the Territory rather than Canberra, the fairly developed party system had returned similar numbers of Labor, Country and Independent representatives. The NT Times warned that if the elected membership is too heavily divided politically, whatever advantage the majority of 5 should bring could be lost. The Liberal Party also contested the 1968 election, but the Country Party's dominance and the reputation of its federal counterpart as a suppressor of the Territory left them with no seats. For 2 terms, the elected majority remained in place, and the parties, despite their differences, were united in pushing the government towards a fully elected legislature. For the Northern Territory, the 23 years of coalition government between 1949 and 1972 were decades when nothing happened. Upon the election of Gough Whitlam's Labor government, there were weeks when decades happened. One such week was in August 1974. On the 1st of August, the Northern Territory Administration Act 1974 was assented to, creating the wholly elected but not yet self-governing Legislative Assembly. Then, on the 7th of August, the Senate Representation of Territories Act was enacted, providing for Territorians from both the NT and the ACT to send representatives to the Senate, having gone unrepresented for more than 60 years. In 1978, the Legislative Assembly was finally granted self-government, and gained the power to make laws rather than ordinances for the Territory in regards to most issues except for health, education and Aboriginal affairs. Since self-government, the administration of the territory was largely left to Territorians, with one notable exception. In 2007, a report detailing allegations of ingrained child sexual abuse and violence in rural communities led the Howard government to implement the Northern Territory National Emergency Response, known to most as simply the Intervention. Among the changes it brought were the banning of pornography and the audit of publicly owned computers to that end, Commonwealth control of many rural townships, and the banning of alcohol in many of these areas. The intervention continued under successive governments until 2022. A year later, the NT government would institute their own alcohol ban, following an increase in crime, particularly in Alice Springs. To be a resident of a territory as opposed to a state is to be put at an inherent democratic disadvantage. States' representatives fought for guarantees of their sovereignty and representation in the federal parliament at the constitutional conventions of the late 19th century. Both the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory had no such guarantees. Between 1911 and 1922, the Northern Territory had no federal representation. The same was true for the ACT between 1911 and 1949. It was not until 1966 that Territory MPs gained full voting rights in Parliament. In 1977, Territorians became eligible to vote in referendums. Though these two territories are now self-governing, they are still subject to the whims of the federal government, which can veto laws passed by the territory parliaments. In 1996, then backbencher Kevin Andrews introduced a bill which prevented the territories from legislating voluntary assisted dying. This ideological intervention in territory affairs was only lifted in 2022. There is still more to do in the field of territory rights. Though Tasmania only has 27% more electors than the ACT, it elects 12 senators to the ACT's 2. While the number of territory senators can be increased by legislation, granting the ACT the constitutional protection of statehood would require a referendum, as Section 125 of the Constitution requires that the seat of the federal government be in territory which shall have been granted to or acquired by the Commonwealth. The Northern Territory has no such constitutional impediment, but Territorians voted narrowly against a referendum on statehood in 1998. Between 2006 and 2016, territory governments from both sides of politics appointed a Minister for Statehood, but the issue has since fallen off the agenda. The stories of John Gilruth and the Legislative Council show, however, that the willingness of Territorians to fight for their representation should not be underestimated.